All right, combining sounds in Swift. So, at WWDC this year, Apple unveiled a new framework called Combine. Quoting from the documentation, Combine is a unified declarative framework for processing values over time. Now, it turns out that this actually shares a lot of things with audio. So, typically you'd find some code in Combine looking something like this. I'm not going to really walk through it all, but it does stuff. It combines things. We can actually combine audio in the same sort of way. You can actually just create two AV audio players and then add them together, and you end up getting a result that sounds different. And that's all I've got. All right. Seriously. So yeah, I am a Canadian software engineer. I started building stuff for jailbroken iOS devices a really long time ago. And now I spend a lot of my time doing stuff with audio, animation, interaction, or reverse engineering, typically Apple products. A lot of the audio stuff that I've been doing recently has stemmed from a lot of creative desires to make my own sort of music. And this is one example of some artists that I'm actually really inspired by. Now pay attention to all the individual instruments if you can, just to get a feel for it. So that is obviously Churches. Big fan. I don't think that anything I'll make will ever amount to something like that, but the thing I wanted to draw out from this was just the number of instruments that were actually required to do something like this. That's like 4 Moog synthesizers all being mixed together and doing all different effects all at once to make a singular cohesive vision, at least for them. So speaking of sound, what really is a sound? Well, physically speaking, a sound is made up of waves oscillating the air that your ears end up picking up. And to generate sound, you end up generating waves. So wave generation typically can be done in lots of ways, but today we're going to talk about it in the context of synthesizers and how they work. So synthesizers, when I say the word, like, what's the first thing that comes to mind? A lot of people would say like Daft Punk, or maybe some vendors like Roland or Korg or Moog. Maybe even just defining the actual sounds they make as being really, really futuristic and sci-fi, or really annoying and broken. To be honest, the coolest thing I find about synthesizers is not only the sounds that they make, but the actual enclosure that they come from. Like, these look really awesome in my opinion, and they're capable of coming up with some of the most iconic sounds you've ever heard probably today. So speaking of how they work, it's basically just a giant circuit board whose sole purpose is to make manipulatable waves. And so this works through 3 primary things as well as a bunch of other things. It starts with an oscillator and then flows through some sort of envelope to control that oscillator, then flows through some sort of effects to amplify it or do something with it, and eventually out to the speaker. So an oscillator is a chip that creates a signal that moves back and forth, much like a wave. And it generates a wave with different parameters. The first is the amplitude, how big or how loud is the wave. The frequency, how fast is the wave? And the shape, what does it actually look like? And so defining what it looks like, it comes down to some singular terms that we've used over time to define them. So there's sine, triangle, square, and sawtooth. But today we're really going to focus on what happens when we start mixing them together. So hearing them on their own, it's really hard to say that, like, this is a sine wave, this is a triangle wave. This is the best representation I have. It's Wavetable synthesizer inside of Ableton Live. And what it'll go through is each of the different forms of waves to show you how they sound like. So as I play this, you're going to see that it's going to slowly transition from one to the other and change the sound over time. So each of those building blocks were essentially one cycle or showing 1 hertz. And that is the way we measure frequencies. So cycles end up being repeated over time, and that's how you make notes. So each one of those were 1 cycle, but if you wanted to make a note, you'd play a lot of those cycles in a singular second. Each of those cycles were also vastly different from one another, and that's what makes the ability to make so many different sounds so vast. So in notes in music, you have a scale, C, D, E, F, G, A, and B. And each of these can be associated with some sort of number that eventually gives us a frequency. You can plug it into the mathematical equation here. So middle C would be 261 hertz. And 440, that number there is actually the frequency of A, which is typically what most people will tune their instruments to. So now you might be saying, what does this have to exactly do with Swift? Well, it turns out that there's a framework called AudioKit. And quoting from the documentation, AudioKit is an audio synthesis, processing, and analysis platform for iOS, macOS, and tvOS. For me, it allows me to make audio development so much easier than it ever was before. You spend less time worrying about buffer overflows and weird errors, and more on actually making the sounds themselves. It automates a lot of the boilerplate code for audio development. Typically, you would have to use some arcane documents from Core Audio or AV Foundation, and it has a lot of free effects and plugins that you can just try out to see what they do. It even has some really cool playgrounds that you can try out with Swift. And so that's what we're going to walk through today and see the sort of things that this framework can bring to you. So when I mean it simplifies things, this is generating a single square wave in Core Audio. This is it in AudioKit, okay? Yeah. So let's start with a simple sine wave. A sine wave, like you've heard before, will sound something like this. So here what we're doing is we're creating a sine oscillator that's oscillating at a frequency of 440 hertz, which is A, so it sounds like this. And what you're doing is you're assigning the output of AudioKit to that oscillator. So whatever that oscillator makes, the output will output that to your device. It's really simple. So then you start getting into things like AKMixer, which is a mixer. So you can create 2 oscillators and mix them together. Maybe if you wanted to play 2 notes at the same time. So here we have A and we have G, which is 392 hertz. So when you play those 2 together, you get something like this. Now, it sounds kind of weird because they're both being played at the same time, and that's typically the nature of mixing sounds. Sometimes it sounds really cool, and sometimes it sounds kind of weird. But the mixer just takes 2 inputs and it mixes them together and sticks it to the output. So a lot of this is very verbose and allows you to really express what you're really trying to do. So mathematically speaking, here is a sine wave, and here is a triangle wave. And here's what happens when you put the 2 together and add them over time. Now that is vastly different and sounds entirely different than the original sound. Here's another one. Okay, so we have 2 sine waves here. Can anyone tell me what would happen if we added these 2 together? Okay, so if you guess that they would just make the wave bigger, then you guessed right. What happens if we take a sine wave and a cosine wave? Can anyone tell me what this would do? Yeah, take silence. So I'll show you that here. Just gonna hop out and hop over to here for a sec. So what I have here is this is a Wavetable synthesizer that I've built for the sake of just showing and demonstrating what's gonna happen. So over here, you can see the output wave when I play something. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna play something, and you'll see it's generating a sine wave down there. So what I can do is I can draw a sine wave on the opposite side. So when these both mix together, you'll get something that you can hear, because these waves aren't exact. But if I copy that wave to the other one, they'll add together. So you'll see down here, the wave is much bigger than what it was before. And if I actually invert the bottom one, you get silence, which is pretty crazy. The accuracy of these switches here and stuff, they're not aligned perfectly, so you won't get pure silence, but effectively, you can see that by manipulating the amount here and making one, you can override the other or have them cancel each other out and make nothing, which is pretty cool. So, hopping back. Now, yeah. So this is called interference, and there's two parts. There's constructive interference and there's destructive interference. When two of them are the same, they'll amplify one another. When they're opposites, they'll actually cancel each other out. So who owns one of these? I'm sure most people would love these on airplanes. The way they work is they actually record the outside noise and then play it back over the outside noise inside your ears, so it actually cancels the outside noise out, which is pretty nuts. Yeah. So, now, you might be saying, well, why would you want to mix sounds? If we have all those like waves that we're using, like what's the point? And the point is that typically it sounds pretty empty. By mixing oscillators and various effects, you can come up with some pretty iconic sounds. So, a very common one is mixing a sine wave with a square sub wave. And by that sub wave, what I mean is it's played an octave lower. So anytime you play something high, you'll have something echoing it that's lower that adds to the depth of the sound. So here, like I said, you just create two different oscillators, you put them in a mixer, and you assign them to the output. So when we play those two together, you'll get something that looks like this. So here we have a square, here we have a sine wave, and you can see down there, it's making this very interesting pattern of the two. If I turn off one, it's mostly square. If I turn up the other, it's mostly sine. Now, these are both the same wave. So what I'm gonna do is I'm actually gonna turn off this one and turn up the sub wave. And you'll see that when I play a sine and mix in a sub, it changes it in a much different way than before. It's actually amplifying the lower end and making the peaks a lot higher, which allows you to create some, well, more full sounds. Back to the slides. Another one that's pretty common is a sine plus a triangle wave. Now, I won't go back and show you what that looks like. I'll just play it like here so you can see what it is. Sine waves are typically pretty calm, and triangle waves are a little bit more sharp. And when you add them together, you can add that sharpness to the calmness to get this sort of like dissonance effect, which is pretty cool. So I'll play that for you now. So this is just a sine wave. We're mixing in a little bit of that sharpness to it. So moving forward, this typically ends up sounding something like an ocarina. So which is, again, that sort of like wind effect. And if you just use one or the other, you couldn't have both to have that really full sounding sound. So this is where things can start to get kind of nuts. So back in the old sort of like techno days, Roland came out with a thing called a supersaw, which is let's stack 7 saw waves on top of one another and see what happens. So when you do that, it actually sounds really kind of boring, like not that interesting at all. So we can actually do that over here. So what I have over here is I have a saw wave up top, and we're going to turn off the bottom stack. And what we're going to do is we're going to turn up the number of voices. Now, voices means that we're going to have multiple oscillators all playing at the same time. So if I play, it's pretty boring. Bring it up. It's louder because we're adding all of those oscillators together. What we're going to do is turn it down a little bit. Okay, so that's 7. Now what we're going to do is each of those oscillators, we're going to slowly detune the frequency of one another just slightly. And you'll see how much the sound drastically changes. It's pretty nuts, right? And that is a very iconic sound. Like Tiesto would have used this in like half his songs. It's extremely popular. And it was only done because you slightly detuned all of them from one another to make like a soundscape that's extremely wide. So the last effect that I really want to go over that's probably one of my favorites is a chorus effect. And it works similar to a supersaw. So what it does is it takes the sound playing on one channel and duplicates it. So it has a sound coming out the left channel and the right channel. But then what it does is instead of detuning them, it actually delays one from the other. So when one side is playing, the other side isn't playing, and so on and so forth. So it ends up creating this like sort of like echoey effect, which is much like an organ. So going back to the synth I have here, I can show you what that looks like. So what we're going to do is we're going to have a sine or a saw wave. We're going to make it just one, just for the sake of showing what it is. It sounds like this. What I'm going to do is I'm going to turn up the chorus effect. And so you can see on this waveform down here how it's slowly changing over time. It's like slowly growing and compressing over time. And what this leads to is you get these really sort of warm and vintage sounding effects. So a lot of the old synthesizers from the 80s use this effect to great degrees. So what I can play right now is something very similar to those. And you end up getting this sound that grows and compresses over time, which makes it feel really, really organic. And the best thing about this is, again, it's dead simple to do an AudioKit. So you end up learning how all of these effects play and work together, and just basically reverse engineer these sounds as you go along creatively. And that's what I think is one of really the best parts out of all of this. So AudioKit really just lets you enter the world of audio development with ease and empowers you to make some really, really cool stuff. Audio development is essentially creative coding, or for me, it's an outlet for me to be expressive. And I think the best part about all of this is whenever you mess up, either you get static or you get a new idea to build off of. And I think that's pretty cool. Thanks.
Okay, we'll take up to 3 questions. So raise your hand. I'll come to you with a mic.
So if you're really interested by what you just showed here, where would you recommend people look to just kind of get their feet wet with this kind of thing? I assume just not going out and buying that whole rig you have up there is the best first use of my time. So I'm just curious about that.
I mean, the only thing you really need is an iOS device of some kind. I just have like a MIDI keyboard here because I'm really not good with touchscreens and stuff. It's a lot easier for me to just play notes as I'm up here. AudioKit.io, as I said, is like a great starting point. If you want to learn audio development, core audio like developer forums is probably not the best way. There are some pretty great textbooks that teach you how to do that if you're really, really curious. And if you know nothing about programming, you can pick up a synthesizer for real cheap online. It doesn't have to be like the latest and greatest. You can pick something up like a monologue for like 200 bucks. And from that, you can really learn just how to make sounds over time and then replicate those when you feel comfortable, which is effectively what I did. Yeah.
Any other questions? All right, we'll do these 2, and then we'll have Philip come up.
Hey, so I think you mentioned that you also produce a little bit in Ableton. Have you found any ways to like share the stuff that you make here with other people, or find other like sounds and stuff that people make, and is there a community around that? Or?
Kind of. I think for me, it's mostly been like, I've been making stuff in Ableton via making plugins for Ableton. And so like this chorus effect I was showing here, I wrote that. And so now I'm making a plugin for that to do in Ableton, just so I can learn stuff on iOS and then move it into production. So production feels like sort of my own as a result.
Cool.
So yeah.
Awesome.
So most of the effects that you showed were constant frequencies. Did you get to play around with altering the frequencies a bit, like FM synthesis or that, or did you explore that at all?
I've explored it. I really want to do a talk on it at some point, but it's really, really, really dense. FM synthesis is basically, instead of modulating the effects here, so these effects were like changing the volume over time, FM synthesis is you're modulating the frequency of the note being played. So what I mean is I could play a C like this, and FM synthesis would be like changing that drastically over time, depending on the parameters that you give it, and using that to change something else, which is vastly more different than what we're doing here, which is called subtractive synthesis, where you're subtracting the sound over time or changing it over time. It's really, really cool. I haven't done enough of it yet, though. Yeah.
All right, give it up for Adam.